It's time for Herd Mentality, the weekly episode where you control the discussion today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, folks, welcome in. Very excited for Herd Mentality. We have some great questions to get into. It feels like the Bills are, in some ways, a really new team after trading away Stefon Diggs. And so some of the perspective and some of the questions are really good to help us get into what this new look Buffalo Bills team is. So let's get into it. The first one today comes from Chris. Chris says, I started to think about what players on the Bills roster next season will make team captains. We've had a lot of known leadership leave this team this offseason. When you think about Poyer, Hyde, Diggs, Trey, Morse, Medikevich, here are my three picks at each side of the ball for team captains in 2024. Tell me who you think. And Chris says offense, Josh Allen, Dion Dawkins, Dawson Knox. Defense, Von Miller, Rasul Douglas, and Taron Johnson. Special teams, Reed Ferguson, Reggie Gilliam, and Mac Hollins. And then he says some other potential candidates I think could be team captains are Terrell Bernard on defense and Cam Lewis for special teams. It's a good question, Chris. As everyone knows at this point, the Bills have moved on from 6 of their 8 team captains from 2023. The only 2 that remain, Josh Allen and Von Miller. And so there is a brand new slate of leadership in terms of team captains coming. And so I thought this was a fun way to start our conversation today. Let me give you my predictions for who will be the Bills team captains in 2024. I have 3 on offense, 3 on defense, and 2 on special teams. On offense, it felt pretty straightforward to me. I agree with you, Chris. Josh Allen, Dion Dawkins, Dawson Knox. In fact, I had a hard time kind of convincing myself that there were any other candidates. It felt like the other guys were just too young, like maybe Dalton Kincaid, Khalil Shakir, James Cook. You feel like those are some influential players, but are they really going to be team captains? Maybe a Connor McGovern, maybe a Spencer Brown. But to me, the most logical picks are Allen, Dawkins, and Knox, knowing Allen and Dawkins have been team captains previously. Defensively, I think there are so many options. So many options. The 3 that I'm going to predict are Taron Johnson, so we align there, but then that's it. I'm picking Terrell Bernard as the quarterback of the defense entering year 3. I think the team looks at him as their communicator, their key piece in the middle of that defense. I think he's going to get it. And then my other pick is Daquan Jones. You know, north of 30, has had 2 really good seasons on this team, signed a 2-year contract extension. I think his leadership will be a big deal for this team in 2024. I thought about Matt Milano. Obviously, he's an awesome player. He's just kind of a quiet guy. Now, I think within the confines of the team, I think he's got a voice, but I just don't know if he's going to get voted. Rasul Douglas, I think about him as well, knowing just all of the rave reviews about his leadership at previous stops. You think about Von Miller, obviously he's been a captain for this team each of the last 2 seasons. And then I do think about Ed Oliver to an extent, but I'm going with Taron Johnson, Terrell Bernard, and Daquan Jones on defense. Then on special teams, I think Reed Ferguson makes a lot of sense. And then there are this group of, you mentioned Cam Lewis, I think Reggie Gilliam, Mac Hollins has been known for his leadership both in college and the NFL. Sam Martin and Tyler Bass are veteran specialists for this team. So I think it'll be some mix of them, but I'm going to go with Reed Ferguson and Reggie Gilliam to round out my predictions for captain. So Allen, Dawson Knox, Taron Johnson, Bernard, Daquan Jones, Reed Ferguson, and Reggie Gilliam for special teams. Tom says, how would the wide receivers in this draft rank in comparison to the last 2 years? If possible, please rank them as if one class to cross-compare by grade. Intrigued to see how this year's big three stack and if this year's tier 2 would be higher up in other ways. Always love to cross-compare grades to other years as those players are now active in the NFL and gives a level of foresight into the future. So I have all of the players drafted in the first round over the last 2 drafts. And as I've communicated before on this podcast, I do numerical grading on all of my prospects. That way, year over year, I can compare how I evaluated that class versus the one that I'm currently working on. And so I can tell you how at least I graded those players. And I don't want to spoil it, but I think I just have to. If you take all of the wide receiver prospects from 2024, 2023, and 2022, my top 3 are Marvin Harrison Jr., Rome Odunze, and Malik Nabers. They are the 3 highest graded receivers that I have over the last 3 years. So yes, when you talk about this big 3 and you measure it against the previous classes, they are my top 3 guys. And so after those 3, number 4, I have Jackson Smith and Jigba. Number 5, I have Jamison Williams. I love Jamison Williams. I think the injuries have not been favorable there. Then I have Chris Olave. Then I have Drake London. Then I had Zay Flowers. Then I had Garrett Wilson. Then I had Jahan Dotson. Then I had Jordan Addison. And then, like, big gap, Treylon Burks and Quentin Johnson. I was not in on Treylon Burks or Quentin Johnson. Those are very clearly my 2 lowest graded players that were picked in the first round at wide receiver over the last couple of years. So when we talk about this big 3, it is a legit big 3. If you're asking where Xavier Leggett would fall into this, for me, he would be right there with Zay Flowers, just right above Zay Flowers. So pretty high on the list. I'm a big fan of him. Brian Thomas would slot just below Jordan Addison in terms of where I would grade them, but not nearly as low. I mean, Treylon Burks, Quentin Johnson, I mean, I was just not in at all on either of those 2 players. So yeah, this big 3 is really real. And actually tomorrow on the podcast, I'm going to do an episode exploring the trade up possibility, right? There's a lot of rumblings about the Bills and, you know, are they going to move up into the top 10 and get one of these big 3 wide receivers? And so I want to talk about the pros and cons of that. I want to look at some historical context to give us an idea of what that would cost. And so that is what's coming your way tomorrow, barring any breaking news. So this is a good conversation starter. Tomorrow we will fully expand on that. All right, folks, coming up here in just a moment, we're going to talk about the target distribution and how things could look in 2024, as well as my confidence in the different position groups for the Buffalo Bills right now. So be sure to stick with me. Folks, you shouldn't have to worry when you're looking to buy tickets for your next big event. Well, you don't have to, because Game Time is here for you. And it's the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you. They have killer deals on last-minute tickets, all-in prices, a view from your seat, and the best price guarantee. I mean, simply put, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. The app is awesome. They give you flash deals. And I also love this. When you buy a ticket from Game Time, it goes straight to your phone. You don't have to dig through emails to find it. It goes straight to your phone. So snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. That's LOCKEDON NFL. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, folks, the next one today comes from Andrew. Andrew says, your wide receiver podcast highlighted what receiver they could target in round 1 with Diggs still on the team. How does Diggs' departure change your thought process on who they should bring in, or does it not change? So we've done 2 episodes now covering different wide receiver prospects that the Bills could draft. And we got more wide receivers to talk about. We're going to get to that this week as well. And so when I started these conversations about the draft and wide receivers, Stefon Diggs was part of the mix. Well, he's not anymore. And so that does open things up. And so I think this is the first thing we should acknowledge, that there is room for a lot of targets right now on this offense. Josh Allen in 2024 is going to throw the ball 600 times, right around that, right? I think it's a fairly good projection, about 600 targets. If you look at this group of Dalton Kincaid, Curtis Samuel, Khalil Shakir, James Cook, and Dawson Knox, those are the players that I perceive as the top 5 targets right now in this passing game. I think you're looking at around 400 targets, maybe plus or minus 25 in either direction, but around 400. Not a math guy, but I said Josh Allen's going to throw the ball 600 times. There is room for, I would say, about 200 targets to be gobbled up by some people, and potentially people that aren't on this team. Now, obviously, some of those are going to go to Mac Hollins. Some of those are going to go to Ty Johnson. Maybe Quentin Morris will get a few. Maybe Justin Shorter will get a few. But even if you factor in all those guys, you still got 150 targets potentially. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. And again, like I said, when we started this conversation, Diggs was part of the mix. And those conversations were rooted in, all right, you want to draft a player that you think can replace Stefon Diggs. And you also wanted to add this size dynamic to the mix. Nothing's changed other than the urgency is bigger because Stefon Diggs is gone. Instead of getting ahead of the Diggs replacement, well, you got to replace him now. And to me, that opens up options. I don't think you go into this saying, well, you need to get this receiver, because now you need to get lots of receiver help. So whether that's offset by a free agent signing at some point, or you double dip with wide receivers, to me, this opens up the entire conversation because you need a lot more now. And here's what it always comes back to for me. Wide receivers are fascinating because they come in so many different shapes and sizes. You can have a guy that's 5'8", 170 pounds. You can have a guy that's 6'3", 230 pounds, and they play the same position. So there is so much variety with skill set, strengths, and weaknesses. But what it always comes back to for me, can you create space for yourself? That's what I'm interested in. And I recognize everyone's going to have different priorities. But I need guys that can create separation, that can create space for themselves with the ball in their hands, that can create space for themselves down the field. Right? That's what's important to me. And that could come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. So yeah, do they need to get a true X receiver that can play on the line of scrimmage, win those heavyweight battles, gobble up some targets, get yourself some buckets? Yeah, but they also need true separation specialists. So to me, the conversation becomes more wide open than ever. Next one here comes from Chris. Chris says, now that free agency has seemingly slowed down for the Bills, how would you rank the Bills' position groups in terms of how much confidence you have in them with the players we currently have at these position groups? And he lists the position groups. This is not meant to ask what position we should focus on in the draft the most, simply what groups you feel confident in and what groups you still feel there's work that need to be done to fortify the unit in some way, either through free agency or the draft. It's a good question here. So, position that I'm most confident in to the least confident in. Number one is quarterback. Josh Allen's a starting quarterback. I think he's the second best player in the NFL. All right, I have a lot of confidence in that guy. And one thing, like in my journey of being a Bills fan right now, and I wonder if a lot of you guys are there too, whenever I am nervous about a game, I always remind myself that the Bills have Josh Allen, and that dude always shows up. Like in the big games, I'm not talking about week 1 against the Jets, but in those big games, 17 always comes through. So yeah, number one is quarterback. Then from there, I thought there was 5 position groups that were very, very tight for me. Like you could put these in any order and I'd believe it. But I have a lot of confidence in these 5 spots. Cornerback, I mean, Rasul Douglas, Taron Johnson, Christian Benford with Kyrie Elam as CB3. That's strong. Linebacker, Terrell Bernard and Matt Milano. Are you kidding me? Nicholas Moreau as your, super sub. You have Dorian Williams, Balen Spector. I like that. Tight end, Dalton Kincaid, Dawson Knox, Quentin Morris. That's as good of a top 3 tight end pairing or trio as you'll see in the NFL. Defensive tackle, love the starters of Ed Oliver and Daquan Jones. Austin Johnson's a really nice depth piece. Deshaun Williams is a pretty solid depth piece. I would love to get more explosive at defensive tackle. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but I think that's a good group, particularly that top 3 and especially those top 2. And then offensive tackle, where you have, I think, a really good starting pair in Deion Dawkins and Spencer Brown to go with. You've added Lyle Collins now, Ryan Vandemark, who's on a good trajectory. I think that's a pretty comfortable group. So a very closely rated after quarterback is cornerback, linebacker, tight end, defensive tackle, offensive tackle. Then I get down to running back. I like James Cook. I like Ty Johnson. I think they need more depth there, and I think there's still questions to be answered about James Cook. I did an entire James Cook podcast the day that the Bills traded for Stefon Diggs, and I hate that it kind of got buried. So if you get a chance to go back to last week before the Bills traded Stefon Diggs, I did what I thought was a great conversation about James Cook and just asking myself the question, how good is this guy? We used a bunch of different metrics on the podcast. Really encourage you to go back and check that out if you missed it, but for any reason. Of course, with the Stefon Diggs news dropping just a few hours after I published that episode, it got lost in the shuffle, but it's a good one. But it's kind of this next year running back. I like James Cook and Ty Johnson. Certainly, they need another guy that's going to make the team. And again, questions about Cook. Safety, Mike Edwards, Taylor Rapp. I like the depth with Cam Lewis and DeMar Hamlin, but I think there's a lot to kind of sort itself out there. Interior offensive line, there's been a major shuffle, right? All of a sudden, your only returning starter from the same position that they were in last year is Osiris Torrance, who was a rookie. You're moving Connor McGovern over. That sounds good. We need to see it happen. Seems like you have David Edwards / Lyle Collins at left guard, but we got to see that come together. Then I go down to defensive end, and I love Greg Rousseau. I like AJ Epinesa as kind of a third defensive end, and God only knows what Von Miller's going to be like this year. I think you have a lot of room for impact at defensive end. And then, of course, wide receiver, where, you just lost Stefon Diggs. You've already lost Gabe Davis, and you're looking at Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel as your top 2 receivers. Those are likable players, but that's not a 1-2 that you can take seriously as the caliber of situation you're looking for as a contending team with an elite quarterback. So I think my biggest areas of concern are wide receiver and defensive end for this football team right now. There's other position groups that need to come together, but that's kind of how I stack it. So top to bottom, quarterback, cornerback, linebacker, tight end, defensive tackle, offensive tackle, running back, safety, interior offensive line, defensive end, and wide receiver. Next one comes from Bobby, who says, who is someone that your team, the Bills, has drafted that you loved and were correct about? Someone you thought would be great but weren't, and a draft pick you hated and were correct about? That's a fun question. So I have an answer for all 3 of these. A player that the Bills drafted that I loved and I was correct about, Wyatt Teller. I loved Wyatt Teller. Had a day 2 grade on him. Thought he could be a really good starter. And then, of course, the Bills traded him away and he's become a really good starter for the Cleveland Browns. He stands out as a player I was just through the moon over, and that one worked out. Another one was Robert Woods. I really loved Robert Woods, and he's had a great career. Obviously, a player that was better once he got out of Buffalo and had a much better quarterback situation. But I was really fired up about drafting Robert Woods, and that looks like that was a big-time hit in terms of a draft pick. A player that I thought would be great but wasn't, Sean Nelson. You guys remember this? I think the Bills got him in the 4th round out of SMU. I thought he was just an absolute monster, and it was right in the Jimmy Graham era of tight end play, and I thought the Bills had themselves their Jimmy Graham. I thought he was going to be special. Unbelievable athlete, had really good production, was really good at the Senior Bowl, and then he just never came together in the NFL. So that was one that I thought was going to be awesome but wasn't. And then prospects that the Bills drafted that I hated, and I was correct about that. I could go on for a long time here, but the 2 that really pop for me are Reggie Ragland and Cyrus Kwanjo. Was not on board with either player. Reggie Ragland was an off-ball linebacker that couldn't run. I thought he was just an absolute disaster of a fit for the Bills. Now, it was Rex Ryan at the time as the head coach, and maybe for that style of defense, he's a better fit, but I don't know. I need linebackers that can run. I can't be having Reggie Ragland. And then Cyrus Kwanjo, I mean, I thought he was just a mess technically, right? Just like literally a technical mess. And that proved to be true in the NFL. So those were a couple of guys. The Bills drafted both of them, I think in the 40s. And I think they traded up for at least Reggie Ragland. So yeah, those were some players that I didn't care for, and it looks like I was correct about that. All right, folks, we got a whole lot more to get to here today, so be sure to stick with me. Have you ever considered what you would do if you had an extra hour in your day? Would you exercise, read, spend time with family and friends, maybe catch up on some sleep? A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you. Make it a priority. Therapy can help you find out what matters most to you so you could do more of it. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. It's not just for people who have experienced major trauma. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you do is fill out a brief questionnaire. That'll get you matched with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. All right, folks, the next one here comes from Steven, who says, for the following 4 positions, could you provide your biggest hit on a sleeper and biggest miss on a dude you evaluated? These are positions I tend to enjoy, and I'd love to hear your successes and not so successes scouting them. All right, so quarterback, wide receiver, defensive tackle, and edge are the 4 positions that he requested. So we're going to give you my sleeper hit and my biggest miss. Quarterback, the reality is I wish I could tell you that I was like in love with Brock Purdy or something like that. I don't have that for you. But I can tell you that I was really high on Justin Herbert. Like I had a high grade on him. I know he was a top 10 pick, but there was a lot of questions about Justin Herbert and like what type of player he's going to be. He was the 3rd quarterback. He went after Tua. So I was really high on him. I had a firm first round grade on Jordan Love, and I had a firm first round grade on Lamar Jackson. So those 3 guys were very polarizing as prospects. I'm happy to be on the right side of them. I think my biggest miss was Josh Rosen. I loved Josh Rosen, and to me, that whole era of quarterback prospects like Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Josh Rosen, massive learning experience for me. I thought it was so important. Like I'd always been drilled into my head that NFL quarterbacks have to win from the pocket. And I thought Josh Rosen could do that. I love the physical upside of Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen. You've heard me talk about football enough to know that I love traitsy prospects. But I didn't think either could consistently win from the pocket to the degree that was necessary to be successful in the NFL. And that's why I love Josh Rosen. And boy, was that a miss. A wide receiver, I think my biggest sleeper hit was DK Metcalf. I've talked about him recently. I had a top 10 grade on him. I thought he was so special as a player, and he's been unbelievable for the Seattle Seahawks. And I know that he was still like a late 2nd round pick, but the fact that I had him as a top 10 grade and he goes in the late 2nd round and he winds up being a big time hit, I'm counting that as a sleeper hit. I also love Tyler Boyd. I had a 1st round grade on Tyler Boyd, and I thought that was kind of controversial because I think maybe some people didn't love the athletic profile, but I saw a guy that can simply get open and catch a football at a high level. My biggest miss is Kelvin Harmon out of North Carolina State. I loved him. His play strength I thought was a superpower of his, and it just didn't translate because you know what matters in the NFL? Getting open. You got to have separation. You can't just win with contested catches and win with like playing through corners all the time. You actually have to be able to separate and create separation for yourself. So as I went through this group of receivers like him, like a Hakeem Butler, I learned a lot. And so that's why you hear me talk so much about separation and creating space for yourself, because I missed on players that can't do it. Interior defensive line, my biggest sleeper hit, I'm going to go with Justin Matabweek. I had a 1st round grade on Justin Matabweek, who had an unbelievable year this past year with the Baltimore Ravens. He wound up going in the 3rd round. I thought that was pretty aggressive that I had a 1 on him. That looks like a good call by me. My biggest miss is Taven Bryan. Was the 1st round pick by the Jaguars out of Florida. I thought the athleticism was so good, and he had some big time flashes, but I think you have to be a better processor. I think you have to have more variety in how you can deconstruct blocks. and he was just underdeveloped, and the athleticism never really turned into production in the NFL. And he's a rotational lineman right now, but certainly not the first round prospect I saw him as, and the Jacksonville Jaguars saw him as well. And when it comes to the edge, I'll give you two here. My biggest sleeper hit, I'm putting down TJ Watt. I had a top 10 grade on TJ Watt. He went in the late 20s, which was very confusing to me. And I think he's he the best defensive player in the NFL right now with Aaron Donald gone? I mean, he's certainly one of the best 2 or 3. I had a top 10 grade on him. And then Trey Hendrickson's probably a more of a true sleeper pick. I had a firm second round grade on Trey Hendrickson. The Saints drafted him, and it was the same year that they traded 2 first round picks to get Marcus Davenport. And I remember saying to myself, I think they got the better edge rusher in the 3rd round in Trey Hendrickson. And that looks like I was absolutely correct about that. My biggest miss, though, Caleb on Chason, another Jaguars pick. So me and whoever the GM was at the time, we were seeing these players one way, and they were turning out to be something else. But Caleb on Chason, I thought his flexibility was off the charts, and he was like a big dude, like a bigger dude for the type of flexibility that he had. He had some injuries and stuff like that. But I think he was like overly versatile. I talked myself into this do everything, like rush linebacker that can play in space and rush and play the run, cover. But as it turns out, you need to be able to do something at a high level. And unfortunately, doing a bunch of things at an okay level doesn't mean you're going to be an awesome player, even if you have really loose hips. So some learning experiences there and some dunks as well. So fun question there. Next one comes from Drew, who says, is it easy to identify gap runs versus zone runs while watching the game on TV? If so, what do I look for? I think it is, but I'm trained to look at this stuff. I think about this all the time. So I recognize that would maybe be a different answer for other people. But if you're trying to identify zone versus gap runs while watching a football game on TV, I think the most obvious indicator to me is when it's a zone run, all of the offensive linemen take a lateral step in the same direction. I mean, that's a pretty big qualifier. All 5 offensive linemen take a lateral step in the same direction. Whereas a gap run, you're going to see a lot of variety. Some guys are going to fire straight off the ball. Some guys might pull. Some guys might block one way. The other one blocks another way, right? There's a lot of variety with the directions that they go. But for a zone run, they all take a lateral step in the same direction. And I think it's like sirens go off. When you know it, you see, yep, they're running zone. Zone left, zone right, right? I'll be watching the game, and I'll say zone right. I'll just call it out so that way I don't know, I just do that. But, yep, that's how I can tell that. Next one here comes from John, who says, simple question, as I've always struggled understanding the differences in a 1 versus 3 technique at defensive tackle. I've seen Johnny Newton mocked to us if he fell to number 28. I believe he's projected as a 3 technique defensive tackle we just paid Ed Oliver. I don't see in that scenario how Newton would play more than 50% of the snaps. If I'm correct in this thinking, would it make sense for the Bills to spend premium draft capital on another 3-tech defensive tackle? Lots to unpack here. It's a fun question. First of all, I don't think you can look at it like this, that Ed Oliver's on the field and Johnny Newton's not, right? Like they could play on the field at the same time. So if you look at those 2 players combining for 100% of the snaps, it's not that they're on the field at the same time, like probably a fair amount. You'd love to have those guys on the field, long and late downs, rushing the passer on the interior. So first of all, acknowledge that it's not, they will be on the same field at the same time. So it's not just a half and half situation. Other things that come to mind here, the caliber of prospect and impact. Like Johnny Newton's an unbelievable football player. That's what makes me like interested in him. Before the whole wide receiver thing was what it is now post Stefon Diggs being traded, when I started to think about who could be there at 28 and realizing that a legit first round talent like Johnny Newton could be had, as opposed to like these second round wide receivers when there's like 12 of them, that's what made me really excited about the idea of adding a Johnny Newton or a Chop Robinson or Byron Murphy, because these guys were first round defensive linemen that were going to make it potentially to 28. And that got me excited. I didn't get excited about a wide receiver that I could probably get a very similar version of at pick 60. So that's a lot of where that's rooted in. But then the rotational nature of the Bills defensive line, let's look at the last 3 years real quick here. And I think this will help you see, okay, well, you do have room for this player, even if it's not a full-time snap taker. And one thing I'll say about defensive tackles, every single snap that they play matters. I can't say the same for a safety. I can't say the same for a wide receiver, right? Every single snap matters. at defensive tackle. You could be a deep safety on an inside run play that gets tackled for no gain, and you know what? That player had the exact same impact on that down as I did. You could be a wide receiver that's backside to a run to the other side of the field that gets tackled for 1 yard, and there'd be no difference if me or my wife was playing wide receiver as the backside player. So congratulations on being on the field for that snap. It didn't matter. Every single snap for a defensive lineman matters. All right, so when you look at the snap quantities over the last 3 years for the Bills defensive tackles, this past year, Ed Oliver, 817. Tim Settle, 413. Jordan Phillips, 391. Daquan Jones, 240. So if he was your third defensive tackle, you're still talking about 400 snaps. 2022, this is probably the most pure example because of the health. Daquan Jones, 692. Ed Oliver, 631. Tim Settle, 435. Jordan Phillips, 365. You'd love to give 435 snaps to not Tim Settle and to a better player. And when I think about the Bills' defensive line and their defensive tackles, where I found myself so disappointed is in that next wave. Like the Tim Settles and the Jordan Phillipses and the Vernon Butlers. Like, imagine if those players were actually good. And that's what gets me excited about Johnny Newton, because you're still talking 400 snaps. The year before that, 2021, Ed Oliver, 698 snaps. Harrison Phillips, 555. Starlo Talele, 370. Vernon Butler, 307. So we still got 400 snaps at least available for this guy. And if they make plays, they're going to play more. So yeah, I think even though it's the same position, there's a lot of opportunity. It's not like you don't play, you play more than one all the time, and they can play together. So there's a huge piece of that conversation. So upgradable area of the team, you talk about being better than what Tim Settle and Vernon Butler and Jordan Phillips have given you. Interior pass rush matters so much in the NFL. And then I just want waves on waves of dudes on the defensive line. I think that's a winning formula for the NFL. How did the Eagles get to the Super Bowl 2 years ago? It's because their defensive line was unbelievable, and they had waves on waves on top of guys. I'm interested in that. All right, last one here today comes from Gadil, who says, can you give me your ranking on who you think are the 5 best slot cornerbacks in the NFL? I'll tell you what, the first 4, that's cake. I can get there so easily. Number 5, I don't know. There's a bunch of guys. So number 1, I have Trent McDuffie from the Chiefs. Number 2, I have Taron Johnson from the Bills. Number 3, I have Kenny Moore from the Colts. Number 4, I have Mike Hilton from the Bengals. Number 5 is probably Desmond King, just because of time on task. But then there's this group of like Brian Branch, Jaquan McMillan, Greg Newsome, Roger McCreary, Michael Carter II, Nate Hobbs. Some good slot corners, but I think it's the right answer is probably Desmond King, because he's done it over a longer period of time. But all those guys that I just mentioned are actually all in their rookie deals, and they are studs, especially that Brian Branch out of Detroit. He's a good football player. All right, folks, so there you have it. Herd mentality in the books. Tomorrow we're talking trades and the whole deal about trading up, what it looks like, pros and cons, all of it. So make sure you come back for that. We're going to get to some prospects this week as well, so don't miss anything. Make sure that you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills, and I look forward to catching up with you again real soon.